Hi guys, this is Jen and I make useful English Lit study videos on Shakespeare, poetry, fiction, literary devices and more. In today's video, we are analysing Macbeth through the lens of feminist criticism. With the incredible villainy of the three witches and Lady Macbeth, is Shakespeare slagging women off in the play? So if you're not already aware, I've made other videos analysing key quotations of the witches and Lady Macbeth, which you can check out in my Macbeth playlist here. But today, we're going to be zooming out a bit and surveying the overall portrayal of female characters in Macbeth. Specifically, we'll be looking at whether these supposedly evil female characters really are that evil, or if Shakespeare actually presents them in a feministic light. So if this sounds like something you're interested in, then sit tight and let's dive straight in. As always, let's start with a bit of context to frame our discussion. If you've watched my other Macbeth videos on ambition and the supernatural, then you'll know that this play was first performed in 1606, 3 years after James I's ascension to the English throne. He succeeded Elizabeth I, which was, of course, a tough act to follow, given the golden age of the Elizabethan era. As a Jacobean play written at the cusp of a power transition from a strong female leader to a strong but somewhat insecure male leader, Macbeth is interesting, especially for the way it presents the interlocks between power and gender. Now, there are several points to consider when thinking about how Shakespeare would have wanted to position women in the play Macbeth. First, the Bard was personally much closer to James I than he was to Liz I, with some critics even positing that he had never actually spoken to Elizabeth directly. Second, James I was a man beset with all sorts of paranoia, most famous of which is of course his belief in witches and of course also old ugly women as evil manifestations of witches that need to be rooted out. And third, the gunpowder plot in 1605 was actually intended not only to assassinate the Protestant James I, but to install his eldest daughter, Elizabeth Stuart, as a Catholic queen, which was possible because she would have been young and malleable enough to have her faith refashioned in the Catholic tradition. So, what do these points suggest? For starters, given these circumstances, it's unlikely that Shakespeare would have wanted to position females in a positive light. But if we happen to think that the witches and Lady Macbeth are negative characters, then the motivation for Shakespeare to portray them as such would have been largely political rather than misogynistic. After all, he was only trying to cover his ass, and we'd probably do the same thing if we were in his situation. But in the next few minutes, I'm going to argue that Shakespeare actually does the courageous thing by not villainizing women or subjecting them to simplistic hero versus villain, Madonna versus whore dichotomies. Instead, he shows women to be complex human beings who, like men, have their own desires, impulses, and failings. Yes, even when it comes to the thoroughly unpleasant witches who are first up on our list. Now, there are lots of reasons to hate on the witches, and to conclude from their evil shenanigans that Shakespeare was somehow presenting the worst of women through these characters. But while we see them as manipulative beings, we can actually also view their successful manipulation of Macbeth as a sign of female power. More important though, is Shakespeare's presentation of the witches as shrewd readers of human character, and equally as supernatural creatures who aren't entirely divorced from human instincts and flaws. Now, we notice very early on that these witches are supernatural agents with foresight about Macbeth's fate, but they also possess insight into human nature and the male ego. One interesting moment where we see this is in Hecate's speech at the start of Act 3, Scene 5, when she admonishes the witches for trading and trafficking with Macbeth in riddles and affairs of death, as she says, "And which is worse, all you have done hath been but for a wayward son, spiteful and wrathful, who, as others do, loves for his own ends, not for you." Here, Hecate points out that Macbeth isn't even worth their time or effort conjuring up magic for him, because like all men, he's only after his own interests, driven by pettiness and anger. This is ironic coming from the witches, because Hecate is assuming a moral high ground here and suggesting that those who can be privy to supernatural prophecies must possess better moral caliber than Macbeth. It also reorients the source of chaos towards Macbeth himself, who, according to her, misuses their prophecy for his own malicious ends out of spite and wrath. What's also intriguing is her comment, "not for you," as if the witches have been messing about with Macbeth because they secretly desire his attention. Seen in this light, it appears that the witches' antics are driven not really by pure evil as conventionally understood, but by a much more vulnerable and feminine impulse, that of wanting to attract and intrigue a member of the opposite sex, albeit going about it in a destructive way. Now, like the witches, Lady Macbeth is often blamed for her husband's downfall. And for good reason, because she knows exactly which buttons to push as she taunts him for not being manly enough, for being a weak milquetoast, and for wasting his potential. But we can see her bullying as a sign of the woman's intellectual and psychological superiority. Because like the witches, Lady Macbeth possesses great insight into the male psyche. In a way, Lady Macbeth is more of an ambitious risk-taker than her husband. But because of her gender, she knows that she can never gain the power and station that a man like Macbeth could. So, in a world where women are deterministic losers and where the wife can only ever play second fiddle to her husband, Lady Macbeth tries her best to correct this injustice by pushing the boundaries of whatever power she can get her hands on, even if it's only by marital association. And this, in a twisted way, can be its own kind of admirable. Towards the end of the play, though, Shakespeare shows that Lady Macbeth, for all her Machiavellian schemes and bravado, is no less vulnerable or immune to fear than your average woman. In Act 5, Scene 1, otherwise known as the sleepwalking scene, Lady Macbeth is a far cry from her earlier, composed self. Driven stark mad by guilt, she suffers a mental breakdown and raves on incoherently about washing hands and going to bed, which are respectively euphemisms for eradicating her guilt and also approaching death. Here, Lady Macbeth is presented as a pitiable character who has suddenly lost all control, a victim of overreaching desires that are all too human. On the one hand, she clings onto the remaining hope of absolute power, as shown in her rhetorical question, "What need we fear who know it, when none can call our power to account?" But the next moment, she reveals that underneath her fearless bluster lies a frightened girl, as she exclaims, "All the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand. Oh, oh, oh." The word little is sure to raise some eyebrows, because little as her hand may be, her ambition certainly isn't. Ultimately, Lady Macbeth disintegrates into this schizophrenic wreck, but she inspires pity rather than disgust, because we see that at least she has been fearless in pursuing what she believes Macbeth and herself deserved. Now finally, there's the minor but no less important female character of Lady Macduff, who briefly appears in Act 4, Scene 2 and is then murdered by Macbeth's assassins. Now the main gist of her lines in this scene is hopelessness and disappointment over Macduff's unannounced escape to England. She sees her husband's act as a cruel abandonment of his family, at once cowardly and stupid, as she comments that all is fear and nothing is love. As little is the wisdom where the flight so runs against all reason. But of course, she's unaware of the danger that Macduff faces vis-a-vis Macbeth's murderous plans. And her comment is dramatically ironic because very soon she and her son will be murdered by Macbeth's men. What's most interesting from a feministic standpoint, though, is the question she poses to her son upon telling him that your father's dead, with the word dead here implying as good as dead. As she asks him, "And what will you do now? How will you live?" So her immediate concern is maternal and thus feminine, because she worries about how her son will cope without a father. But when her son retorts with, "How will you do for a husband?" Lady Macduff gives a surprisingly feministic answer, as she says, "Why, I can buy me 20 at any market," i.e. husbands are a dime a dozen and I can find a new one anytime. For a Renaissance audience, this tongue-in-cheek statement would have seemed incredibly brazen. But for modern audiences like ourselves, this indicates Shakespeare's progressive awareness that women, despite social constraints, are much more independent and self-reliant than were generally perceived back then. Indeed, when Lady Macduff receives the messenger's warning for her to flee, she demonstrates stoic insight by asking, "Why then, alas, do I put up that womanly defence to say that I have done no harm?" The adjective womanly connotes weakness here, and that womanly defence implies unnecessary self-justification of one's existential worth. By rejecting this, Lady Macduff again demonstrates a kind of toughness that goes against the feminine grain. Now, I want to wrap up this video by reminding us of the second apparition's fateful prophecy that none of woman born shall harm Macbeth. Of course, we know that besides Macbeth's faulting ambition, he is ultimately undone by a fundamental misunderstanding of female biology, because he doesn't know that women can give birth in more ways than one, and is thus killed by the Caesarean-born Macduff. So in a way, this tells us that despite having been king for a hot minute, Macbeth's authority has always been dwarfed by female power in the play. From the very start, as he falls to the seduction of the witch's prophecy, to throughout the play as his wife prods him towards the regicidal path of no return, to the end of the play when the not of woman-born Macduff defeats him to restore order. Whew! So I know this is a bit of a beefy video with lots of details and content, and I will leave you to consider whether Macbeth is a play that does women justice. In any case, I'd encourage us not to take the evils of the witches and Lady Macbeth at face value, much less to conclude from their actions that Shakespeare was somehow being misogynistic or anti-feministic in this play. So let me know your thoughts on this in the comments section below, and as always, please do hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to my channel, and switch on the bell notification so you don't ever miss a top grade lit study video from me. And I'll see you guys very soon.